If you are a fan of epic fantasy, and of course you want to know what happens next in the Traitor Son Cycle after the events in the second book, The Fellsword, then today's book just might be for you. Today I'll be reviewing The Dread Wyrm by Miles Cameron. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking a look at the third book in the Traitor Son Cycle. Now, let me get a few things out of the way that I have said in the previous two videos that I'm going to say again in this video, and that is that I find this book and this series collectively absolutely engrossing and fascinating, and it does some things really well. But this book, just like the other two, has the same issue, and that is that it is really difficult to follow. And I don't think that that is really all that controversial to say. I think almost anyone that I've asked that does like this book, their thoughts on the book, they'll say the same thing. They'll say, it can be hard to follow along. And I've had some people suggest that you then go back and reread the book. That is something that I may do, especially since I really enjoyed this book and it made me appreciate this series a little more, even though I was continuing with my same struggles. So let me give you a quick synopsis. There will be some spoilers of what happens in this book to the best of my understanding. As usual, we have the problem of I'm not really sure if I understood what was going on most of the time. And then we will talk about some of the things that I really liked about this book and some things that I felt could have been maybe done a little different. And of course, who I would recommend this book for. So like I said, this is the third book, so it's going to pick the story up after the events of the Fellsword, where our Red Knight, or the main character, Gabriel Murians, who is still a bit of a mystical character. We don't fully understand his past. We know that he has some political connections, but he also knows that he has some kind of connection to the wild, and that he has just some kind of mysterious origins that you don't fully understand, let alone how he's become so incredibly capable and successful over the years. He is a mercenary. He leads a band of mercenaries, but he's also now become much more entrenched in the politics of this world in which he lives, which there's still a lot of questions of exactly what that world looks like. And in this book, he's actually grappling with his newfound fame and responsibilities as a powerful commander, because he had been so successful in the previous book, and he now has some actual political heft behind his responsibilities, and not just as the leader of a band of mercenaries. In this book, Gabriel's life is going to become increasingly complicated by the ongoing threat from the wild, which is this antagonist that I'm still not entirely sure exactly what it is. There's references to certain types of elements of the wild, which includes stuff like boggans, but then there's also an element of it that just seems to be somewhat anthropomorphized animals. So there's at the very beginning of the very first book, there's this long discussion of a bear and her cub, and it is presented in a way as if she has a little more to her than just our understanding of a bear in nature. So Gabriel's connection to the wild, plus his newfound responsibilities, is of course part of his duty to serve the emperor. And so this novel is actually going to explore all of those different issues in, of course, the land in which he has his newfound responsibilities in Alba and the surrounding regions, as all of these different enemies start to multiply on a variety of fronts. And the place that we are going to see them come to fruition most visibly in this book is at the Emperor's Grand Tournament. It's a very significant event in the novel. It's going to be the tournament that is meant as this martial contest that's trying to draw knights and warriors from across the land, and Gabriel is of course obligated to participate, even though he himself, especially as the leader of a mercenary group, didn't really have the same sense of showing off bravado. He has much more of a sense of just fighting for survival. And so he finds a tournament like this is kind of a bit superfluous and not something that he necessarily wants to engage in, but it being so closely connected to the nobility, he now has to. And so he's going to try to maintain his standing and try to protect his allies. And so he's going to be drawn into the tournament. And it's much more than just a display of strength. It is also going to be political arena, where you're going to see alliances that are being forged and rivalries that are, of course, being continued to be deepened and all the more empowered. And Gabriel's performance in the tournament is going to cement his reputation, but it's also going to draw the ire of powerful enemies. And as you know, he's already dealing with a fair amount of enemies. The tournament is going to be fraught with danger, as you have sabotage and intrigue that is running rampant. Gabriel's ability to navigate the challenges both on and off the field are really going to showcase his strategic brilliance and his unyielding determination. And of course, that all goes back to his inherent desire to just survive and not necessarily just show off how capable he is at fighting. Also, you have in the background the wild, an ever-present force in the series, and it is growing more dangerous and unpredictable. You have a variety of creatures like dragons and of course the wyverns and the dreaded Wyrm, which is where we get the title from, that are threatening the human settlements. And a major plotline is actually going to involve Gabriel and his company dealing with this titular Dread Wyrm, which is a massive ancient dragon that poses a catastrophic threat to the kingdom. And the Wyrm's awakening is going to be tied to a deeper magic and a broader world, and its presence is going to escalate the conflict between the forces of humanity and the wild, which is something that has always been part of these books, but has also only been one part of the books. One of the things that complicates it as you are trying to understand both what's going on between the wild and as well as within the human realm, and you are of course going to see that be exacerbated by the end of this book because of the involvement of this Wyrm and the added element of a greater magic that's being involved. There's a few major themes worth pointing out. Obviously, the political intrigue continues to play a central role, with Gabriel trying to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, something that he doesn't consider to be his forte, or at least it's not something he's all that interested in initially. Of course, the Emperor faces challenges to his authority, and Gabriel must tread carefully to avoid becoming a pawn in the schemes of others. And so he himself is trying to deal with his relationship with the Queen of Alba, and he is, trying to avoid just the complexity of their shared goals as well as personal interests that at times clash, but at times are going to bring them together in a way that is really going to add a sense of instability to the kingdom and the larger political games that are being played. Which means betrayal, which you'll see within Gabriel's own ranks and among his allies, are really going to add to the tension, and these betrayals are often going to stem from fear and ambition, or just manipulation by external forces. And all that, of course, highlights just the fragile nature of trust in a world at war. And as I've already pointed out, this is a world at war on various fronts. Also, Gabriel's growth is a big part of this. We see from the very beginning that he's an incredibly capable fighter and leader. I think that's an important part that's worth understanding. I know referring to him as a knight gives you this sense of being a very capable warrior, but I think the thing that's really trying to come through in these books is that he's much more than just a warrior. His abilities go beyond fighting, and they go into leading, be that on the field, but also he clearly has some abilities with navigating the politics and the courtly life, which he appears to dislike, but he's also proving to have a real ability at it. Throughout the novel, Gabriel's character is going to continue to evolve, and you'll see him struggle with the burdens of leadership, at least the elements of leadership that he wasn't all that interested in, at least initially, and of course his relationship with those closest to him. And something that I haven't said much before is, of course, he clearly has some kind of power. The magical element of these books is a little confusing, but you know that he has some magical abilities that are becoming all the more important as the stakes are increasing, and we're starting to see more and more come together. And that in some ways is going to isolate him, which can be really problematic for a leader. But that's also going to lead to a lot of internal conflicts. He has his humanity and a certain sense of allegiance to humanity, but you also see him becoming all the more intertangled with the wild, and so there's these monstrous forces that he is trying to not necessarily command, but certainly trying to develop a particular type of relationship, so that you see that the concept of good guys and bad guys, or antagonists and protagonists, is not always super straightforward in these, even though you're always cheering against whoever he's fighting against. But you also see the politics playing out in this book that make it a real challenge to really understand who exactly you're cheering for beyond just the Red Knight. And that's something that is all the more poignant and all the more understandable in this book. And I think that's because the court life has been an element in all of them, but this one, it is really being put front and center because of the tournament and all the different elements that are at play because of that. As usual, you can of course expect some incredible fight scenes. That is what Miles Cameron does best. And you have an incredible climactic battle in this one that is going to lead to just some of the best descriptions and the really most engaging elements of this series, which has pulled me along this far. And obviously I'm pretty sure I'm going to finish this series. I have definitely enjoyed this book more than the first two. I think from what I've seen, the second one is the one that's usually the most harshly criticized, mostly because it does a lot more world building, and it's setting up in a way that the first book doesn't quite put as much energy into, and then you start to see those things coming to fruition in the third book, and I presume that we'll see this continue through the fourth and fifth book. And those are the things that I really enjoy about this book, and those are probably some of the things that would draw most people in. I've said this before and I'll say it again, that one of the unique characteristics of this series in particular, it obviously has that high medieval paradigm, which is very common for fantasy books, but this one goes even deeper and is much more strongly connected to that high medieval mindset, so much so that Christianity plays a bigger role than you'd expect. So you do have a variety of religions and forces at play, yet there is still the culture of Christianity that very much existed in the Middle Ages is still there. And you even have this presentation of an idea of a Dar al-Islam or a Muslim world. So there's obviously a variety of religions. There is also clearly references to places that at times do exist, but then at times they appear to be at least a veiled reference to Spain or France. So you're seeing a really heavily reflected elements of the high medieval time period taking place here, which I think is distinct, and I actually think it works in its favor. I enjoy the high medieval paradigm in fantasy. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I was pulled into fantasy. I also like to try new things, but I think that it is surprisingly distinct at how strongly it is tied to that time period in a way that is not actually always all that representative. And so that was something that I really enjoy about this series, and has given it surprisingly more depth than I would have expected. Instead of it being a shortcut, I think it's something that has given this author something to give it this real balancing act of, still being fantasy, very much so in many respects, but still borrowing heavily from history in a way that is not always to the same extent as you might find in other fantasy series of this nature. And I actually, by this point, I'm really enjoying that, and I appreciate that. So who is this book for? Well, it's the third book in the series, and so you've gonna have to have read the first two for starters. If you have read the first two, you probably are still interested in continuing. To answer that more broadly, who is this series for? Well, I would say that this is definitely for fans of fantasy, high fantasy, and I would also say that it is for those that are willing to understand that. I don't want to say it's a slow burn, because actually one of the things I enjoy about this book is it's almost always got something exciting going on. It's just a matter of understanding or appreciating all of those various things, and you do jump around a fair amount. And so I will say that it is for people that are ready to put a little more effort into understanding what's going on. And if that is your type of book, then this series just might be for you, and I would highly recommend it. On the flip side of that, who is this series not for? Well, it is definitely not for people that don't like fantasy, because this is the quintessential fantasy. And it is not going to be for people that want a much more straightforward storytelling, because that is one of the things that's difficult for this. And it's not going to be for those that don't love those fight scenes, because boy, the battles that he writes are great. And I think these are one of the best things about these books. And I would say that if that's not something that interests you, then this is not going to be your fantasy series. But I would certainly like to hear what you guys have to say about this book in particular, if you have any thoughts about the Dread Wyrm. But also, I would love to continue the conversation about this series as a whole. And no spoilers for me. I have yet to finish the series. But if you want to, maybe give me a little insight or some suggestions about how to best appreciate the final books in the series, please let me know. Of course, put that in the comments, but don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. And until next time, keep those pages turning.